Good day, folks. I'd like to talk about the peg cells, and I've noticed throughout the videos there's a lot of questions, and I've tried to address them as good as I can, but sometimes, in the comments it can get pretty messy. And there's been some repeated questions, so I'll try and get the most out of it. So a lot of people want to build the peg cells, and they want to know what works best, what doesn't work. So the main ingredient is what I use is the peg electrolyte as the solid state, and it's this stuff here. In Canada it's Restoralax, okay? It's this right here. And the ingredients here is, people are asking for the active ingredients because you have to have 100% poly, I have a hard time with that word there, but it's 100% polyethylene glycol 3350. And here it is right there. So that's all it is, and sometimes some of this stuff in other countries has medicinal ingredients that mix into this, and it's not good. It nullifies the effect. So you have to be very careful that it's 100% peg, okay? Now, this stuff here is pretty expensive, folks. And what I've realized is here in Canada, there's another in, it's called Option Plus at Guardian Drugstore. It's essentially the same thing at half the price. Obviously the same company because they're literally identical, but different label. But the same thing here, the same composition, and yeah, so now you want to know how to prepare this. So people were asking about the composition, and because as you see I have all these different cells, I never came up with quite a standard for it, but I'll give you some pointers on how it happens. So let's say I want to mix this little cell's worth, so maybe a few spoons of peg electrolyte, and I would mix that with a few drops of hot water. Now what seems to work best is when it becomes melted into like a translucent paste, okay? Like an oily translucent paste. What happens is if it's too thick, very pasty, when it dries out it tends to get chalky and break apart. If it's too watery, it just doesn't really dry out. So you gotta get that perfect paste. You'll see what I mean once you start constructing them. So I found out just a few drops of water, hot water by the way, and later on I found out that it was easier to just use an old pot at low heat and just melt that all in there. So optionally, you could build the peg cell with just the peg and it will work. The electrodes, magnesium and conductive carbon, but I've experimented with various. You could substitute the magnesium with a aluminum foil, and it does the same thing. You could use zinc and copper if you don't have conductive carbon and magnesium. You got about the same thing. So that's about as far as I took it with experimenting with different electrodes. Now obviously you're going to want to make sure your cell dries. It could take a few days. Test the continuity to make sure there's no measurable resistance. We've discussed in previous videos, you're always going to have the moisture of the air and whatnot. So there's always, even if the meter can't measure it, there's still that minute amount of it. So not really relevant, but just to put it out there, of course, you know. So the important part is that the meter has no continuity, and even at the highest range it doesn't measure a resistance. It's a good indicator that they're properly as isolated as they can get anyways. So that's a big part of it, is to keep your electrodes isolated for proper operation. Now of course, as soon as you pour this in, you'll get a voltage. So as it is wet, you could say it's a traditional galvanic effect. We don't want this, so we want to wait for it to dry, and we want to use electrodes that are non-corrosive so we could withstand that temporary effect, so there's no corrosion, or very minimal. during the drying process. Once it's dry, obviously there won't be corrosion influenced by that, not any more so than being in the natural environment from natural moisture in the air. So in other words, it has the potential to last a lot of years if you build them properly. So this is actually one of the first cells that I experimented with, and it still puts out. You know, this was done in the winter time, and if I put the voltmeter here, I don't know if you guys are going to see that, but I'm just going to measure it now. 1.01 volts. So it's still putting out over a volt. This has been in my closet forever, just stored there. And this blue stuff here was an experiment. I tried to use the, instead of mixing the peg with a drop of water, I had that concentrated syrup, electrolyte, sports drink. That's why it's blue. It smells like Kool-Aid. I wouldn't eat it though. So that pretty well doesn't, I don't know if it helps it out or not, but you know, it puts out 1 volt. So take it for what it is. I'm giving you all the information I have. I don't think I actually discussed this one before. Maybe I was trying to keep it a secret or something. But yeah, a little squirt of sports electrolyte in there instead of a drop of water. But not too much because it's sodium base, right? Electrolyte, salt. So you don't want to corrode your electrodes. So, but again, with careful choice of electrodes, as you can see, months later, 0 corrosion, and still puts out a nice potential. Now this one here is another one of the original cells, and I put copper oxide. I mixed it with maybe a spoon of copper oxide powder. This is it right here. I ordered this. It's simply black copper oxide powder. It makes a mess. And you got to be careful with the copper oxide, you know, you don't breathe the poisonous, you know, dust and whatnot. So proper ventilation. And oh yes, as some have mentioned, if you're going to use carbon, this is like fiberglass insulation. It can irritate, it can get itchy, so work with caution. Wear gloves if you have to. Now, if you're going to build the peg cells and you don't want to do any advanced stuff like run them as capacitors and stuff, what seems to work best is these pipe designs here, where you have like kind of like the John Hutchinson type cell, but instead in the middle here we have our peg mixture that hardens into the pipe. Now this provides a little bit more current if you consider 1 to 2 milliamps a lot of current, but in relevance to U-amps, it's not bad. But the thing with these is I wouldn't run them long term for, you know what happens is you may end up having moisture trapped here that'll never dry, that could create a very small resistive path, especially at varying heats. So what I'm getting at is I wouldn't trust these if you're going to run series potential experiments like I've demonstrated. Instead, you want to build your peg cells well-distanced electrodes to make sure there's no continuity, and that by design the peg can properly solidify, right? So depending on the application, folks, there's different variants of how you can go with these peg cells. And this was the stuff that I've experimented with. Instead of adding water, I just put these gel beads, and people keep asking about them because they can't find them. It's at the dollar store. This is all it says. Gel beads, 500 grams. Just add water, but I don't have to. It's already moist. And these melt in the peg when I mix them, especially at low heat, as I've explained. And here's the back, which doesn't show anything. Clores Crafts, C-L-O-E-S, Clores Crafts. That's all I got. So Don't know really what the composition is. I tested it. It gives me, you know, it tends to like want to crystallize the peg. It dries out, but it kind of expands, I guess, with the absorption of the moisture from these. I don't know, but it did work. But again, you don't have to do that. That was just an experiment. And if you're going to feed high voltage in them, of course, the regular stuff, high voltage can kill. Be careful. Use common sense. You know, be careful. And yeah, I mean, that's about it. I wanted to try and answer as many questions as I can here about these peg cells. And what's interesting is these two here. Oh, the copper oxide did something different. See the composition of the peg? It made it hard like cement. If you just use the peg as is, and it tends to harden, but kind of like sugar, where if you drop it, it'll shatter. It's not very solid. And I found that adding just a little bit of copper oxide powder in the mix, it's, you know, it's hard like cement, but you still get that potential difference. So as a matter of making the cell more robust, the copper oxide played a major role in that. So people were asking about the copper oxide and its benefits. That seems to be one of them. Now I've been experimenting here. I actually put a third wire in there sticking out because I wanted to see if I can get like diode-like properties with the copper oxide. That's in the works. So I'm not there yet, but with that said, I posted a little off topic, a very interesting conversation I had with GPT, the Tom Bearden model that I made for everyone. You can find it at the link. And it basically suggested a way of basically tapping into the 0-point field or something like it with capacitors. It's really big, it's intensive, so I can't really get into it here because I will leave you a link in my form, and it's a very interesting discussion anyways, because I've never heard of this method before, and I kept probing it, you know. Are you sure you could run a zener diode like this? It insists, so, you know, one of these days I'll have to start experimenting with it, but the information, in case it's valuable, I put it on there. So again, I encourage all you folks, if you're interested, to go into the forum and participate in that discussion. And with that said, I hope I've answered a few questions anyways of the building and running the peg cells. And I'm really satisfied with these first generation ones because they have not failed, they have not corroded. This was at the end of winter, like in March, the beginning of March. And we're still going. So, you know, what I'd like to do, folks, is somehow if I could get a 3D printer one day and figure out a template of like a Zamboni-like pal, something like ice cube trays, but a snappable model where we can get like 1,000 cells. The key here is if we could actually make, without any external trigger, nothing fancy, just the peg cell on its own, if we can get a potential of 1,000 volts, we can start doing very interesting things with that by pulsing it into LC circuits and Tesla coil-like potentials and, you know, self-looping setups and amplifications and self-regaging magnetic amplifiers. I mean, but you gotta get that potential to like a Zamboni, a real traditional Zamboni pile. They're pretty big, and it's similar concept. They use basically paper as an electrolyte and the moisture of the air. We're using the pegs, so we don't have that fine space in between to stack them up. So that's why it would be quite a big thing by the time you get 1,000 peg cells. But, you know, for the sake of an experiment, it would be quite the device, because, you know, even if you could get a couple watts out of it, I mean, a couple watts, folks, will charge basically any battery. So, I mean, within the day or two. So that's good backup to have, good concept to experiment with. But the big challenge, folks, is stepping this up to 1,000 volts natively, not with oscillations. Even though we can do that, and I've shown that in other videos, it's very interesting. But the key thing here would be to get them in a series setup to 1,000 volts. So then we can incorporate spark gap and spark gap like systems with mostly the electrostatic pure potential, which charges capacitors, dumps capacitors, gives us our current, generates our amps, joules, whatever you want to use, and go from there. So with that said, folks, looking forward to your comments as always. If you have more questions, let me know. From time to time, I'm going to try and answer everything I can here. And with that said, have yourselves all a great day. Thank you.